Last week, I identified players like Woody Marks, Tez Johnson, Jamison Williams, Alec Pierce, and Jawan Johnson as potential sneaky starts who all had big games and helped fantasy managers take home the win. So let's do it again in week 11. I'm going to try to be even better this week. I've identified some under the radar players who have advantageous matchups that could just help you win your week 11 matchup. Now, I do want to be clear. I am not saying these guys are must starts. I'm not even saying they're necessarily good starts. But if you're in a pinch with buys, injuries, whatever it is, these guys do at least have potential. They have upside. You could certainly do worse than starting these guys. Let's start at running back in Arizona, Emari Demercado. So a couple things working in Demercado's favor here. Number one, Trey Benson, it does not sound like he's coming back definitely this week. They haven't even activated or opened his 21-day window to be activated from the IR. So he is certainly not playing this week. Then you also have Bam Knight, who's technically been the guy getting the most touches in this backfield. He was limited all week with an ankle injury, questionable going into week 11. He could play, he could not play. Obviously, if he's out, that's a big boost to Demercado. But I think even if he plays, I still definitely prefer Demercado in this matchup. When you look at it over the last two games, yes, like I said, Bam Knight has been the guy playing more, 51% of the snaps to 40%. The attempts have actually been pretty even here, those 36 to 34%, and so has the routes. And yeah, Bam Knight's had a higher expected fantasy points per game than Demercado, but we don't care about expected fantasy points. We want real fantasy points. Look at the difference in the production between these two guys. Over those two games, Demercado has almost 3 times as many yards as Bam Knight, averaging almost 8 yards per carry. Bam Knight just 2.89. A 16% explosive run percentage to only 5, has a higher yard after contact per attempt, yards before contact per attempt, and has doubled him in fantasy points scored. Demercado is the guy with the juice, with the big playability, and that's what I want in my fantasy lineup over some plotter who might get slightly more touches. And then again, when we take into account the fact that Bam Knight is dealing with an ankle injury, maybe this week we do see Demercado get more touches than Bam Knight. And if that's the case, you got to feel great because this 49ers defense is all sorts of banged up. Last week, Kyren Williams and Blake Corum combined for 128 yards and 2 touchdowns. Even if Bam Knight plays, I still really like Demercado this week as a low-end RB2, RB3 type or flex type. But if Bam sits, then I really like Demercado this week. I've only got one more running back for you, but that's going to be Chris Rodriguez of the Commanders going up against the Miami Dolphins. Left last week's game with that injury, but it did score a touchdown before he left, which is nice. Now I want to say, before I dive into why I like Rodriguez, I do want to say really quick, I don't think a lot of people have realized, I've been saying for a couple weeks now, hey, this Miami run defense isn't that bad anymore. Sure, they're still 8th worst against running backs, but over the last 4 games, they're only 15th worst. Remember, they were the absolute worst for a while. So for whatever reason, they have gotten better against the run, but they're still not elite against the run. And also, look at what we saw last week for the Commanders' running attack in that first half before Chris Rodriguez left with an injury. He had played 68% of the snaps, had handled 46% of the attempts, had run almost 50% of the routes. Meanwhile, Bill, the guy who was supposed to be the guy here, only played 16% of the snaps, only had 15% of the attempts. He barely played when Rodriguez was healthy. It looks like the Commanders have finally given up on Bill and said, okay, fine, Rodriguez, go ahead, do your thing. Remember, he was looking good in training camp, and then they just decided not to even have this guy be active earlier in the year. But he got a touchdown last week. He was obviously the guy they trusted. I think that's going to be the case. Remember, he left with that shoulder injury, but he wasn't even on the injury report this week. He's good to go. No, this is not a smash. You're going to probably hear people say, it's Miami, you got to start. No, it's not, but it's still a good enough matchup here that I would be willing to take a chance on Chris Rodriguez this week. And hey, real quick, before I get to the rest of the names on this list, I just want to ask, if you're enjoying the video here, hit that like button and take one moment to subscribe to the channel. We would greatly appreciate it. All right, let's move on to some wide receivers now. I got plenty of options here for you, and I'm going to start with Christian Watson going against the Giants. Not even on the injury report this week, so we don't have to worry about that. Fully healthy, fully good to go. This is a fantastic spot for Christian Watson. The Giants are allowing the 7th most points to wide receivers and the 9th most points to outside wide receivers. Not only that, the Giants play the most man coverage of any defense and the 5th most single high about 60% of the time. You look at Christian Watson this year, he has his highest yards per out run and fantasy points per out run versus man and single high this year. These are the coverage shells Christian Watson eats up. Now, I know last week the box score did not show a big game for Christian Watson, but we know this guy has big play upside. He did have a couple big plays called back by penalty last week. It happens. This feels like a bounce back spot for this Packers offense against this Giants defense. I want to take a chance on Christian Watson. He's got the kind of upside I am looking for. Again, if I'm looking for somebody like desperate at flex and I can choose between some, boring floor play type guy or chase the upside of Watson, give me the upside of Watson this week against the Giants. And I can't believe I'm saying this, but give me the upside of Wan'Dale Robinson? Really? Well, look, I'll be honest. I was going to put Darius Slayton on this video, but he has been ruled out, and this has now opened the door for Wan'Dale Robinson to have a huge game this week. Obviously, having Jameis Winston as the starting quarterback is going to help all the pass catchers here. We know this. We've seen this. But when I dove into it a little more, I was surprised, hey, Wan'Dale Robinson might actually have upside. He might not just be a guy who's going to need a ton of volume. First of all, you look at Jameis Winston last year in the games he started, he ranked 4th among all QBs in average depth of target and 14th in deep throw percentage, while also having the 4th lowest checkdown rate. Now you might think, well, isn't this bad for Wan'Dale Robinson? Because that's kind of what I thought, which is why I was going to put Darius Slayton on the video. Then I dove into it a little more, and I was kind of surprised here. You look at it, when we take out the games where Malik Nabers has been out this year, and we look at targets that went at least 10 or more yards down the field, Wan'Dale actually has more targets and a higher target share than Darius Slayton. And if you look at week 6 to 7 this year when Darius Slayton was out, he had 2 targets over 20 yards in those games, which was 2nd most on the team. Combine this with the fact that he already has a very healthy 25% target share, even with Darius Slayton playing, and Jameis Winston under center. I know it's a tough matchup against the Packers here, but they're probably going to need to throw the ball a ton. Jameis Winston will sling it. He's going to get the targets. I think Wan'Dale Robinson actually has upside for your fantasy team this week. All right, now a guy I had on this video last week was Quentin Johnston, and he was okay, right? He wasn't terrible, but he didn't necessarily go off for your fantasy team. He didn't kill you if you started him, but he didn't go off. I'm going to take a chance on him again this week against the Jacksonville Jaguars. Right now, they're allowing the 10th most points to wide receivers overall, but they're allowing the 3rd most points to wide receivers that line up on the outside. Obviously, QJ on the outside, I think it's about 90% of the time this year. But what I really like is we've seen a massive change in this, passing the targets in the Chargers offense over the last 2 games. You look at it over the last 2 games. Quentin Johnston has actually led the team in routes and target percentage. Ladd 2nd, Gadsden 3rd, but look at Keenan. This is why I really like QJ this week. Keenan all the way down 55% of the routes, only a 14% target share. Look, after the early part of the season where Keenan was looking good, it looks like they've kind of said to Keenan, hey, we don't need you out there as much anymore. QJ is still out there a ton. He's had an end zone target each of the last 2 games. He leads the team in first read percentage and expected fantasy points per game. It's going to happen pretty soon. There's going to be a big game for QJ here. All the signs are pointing to it. I want to take a chance on that in this type of matchup against this Jacksonville defense that he could certainly exploit and have a big game against. And I think I want to take a chance on Jerry Jeudy this week. Yeah, I want to take a chance on Jerry Jeudy this week. Kind of crazy, out of nowhere, from going from a complete absolute bust, doing nothing for your fantasy team. Maybe he's going to be a second half league winner again. But you look at it last week, had a 37.5% target share here, 0.32 targets per hour run, got an end zone target, and an insane 44% first read percentage, and hit 20.2 expected fantasy points. So you can say, well, okay, it's just one of those games, right? It's one of those games. Well, I don't know. Maybe something actually changed here, because the big difference we saw last week was the Browns let offensive coordinator Tommy Rees take over play calling duties, and we saw a bit of a shift here, right? We saw Fannin clearly the preferred tight end, Jerry Jeudy clearly the preferred wide receiver. So I'm going to bet on this being an actual thing now with Tommy Rees calling the plays. Now this week on paper, it looks like a smash matchup. The Ravens allowing the 4th most points to wide receivers, but I do want to say since the bye, they've been a little better, but they're still allowing the 9th most points to wide receivers. They haven't been that much better. This is still not a defense that is going to scare me. Not to mention the Ravens play the 6th most man, and he has been much better against man than zone. You look at it against man, a 0.24 targets per out run, 1.28 yards per out run, 0.25 fantasy points per out run. Versus zone, those numbers are only 0.16, 0.78, and 0.18. So, look, Jerry Jeudy could just go back to, this could be an absolute trap. There's no question about it. This could be an absolute trap. But based on what we saw last week and the fact that there's a reason we might have seen it and the fact that it's a good matchup, I'm going to take a chance on him again. And I'm going to take a chance on Tez Johnson again this week, going up against the Buffalo Bills. Again, had him on here last week. He had a great game. No reason why he can't do it again. We thought maybe Chris Godwin was going to play, right? Started the practice. Nope. Chris Godwin ruled out. That is going to keep the door open for Tez Johnson for at least one more week for him. And this is another good spot because the Bills play the 9th most too high coverage, about 55% of the time. You look at it, he sees by far his highest targets per out run, yards per out run, and fantasy points per out run versus too high this year. You look at it against man zone single high, 0.16, 0.17, 0.14 targets per out run, 0.92, 1.76, 1.03 yards per out run, and only 0.29, 0.35, and 0.25 fantasy points per out run. Then you go to the end, you look at too high, 0.22 targets per out run, 2.34 yards per out run, and a massive 0.63 fantasy points per out run. This is a great matchup for Tez Johnson again this week. Obviously, you're starting Igbuka. Igbuka is a strong start, pretty much a must start. But Tez Johnson has shown he's got upside. He gets end zone targets. It's another good week to take a chance on. Now, if you need to take a chance on tight end, I've got a few for you. Let's start with Dalton Schultz. He's quietly getting elite usage right now. You look at it over the last 4 games, he has the 2nd most targets among tight ends, just 1 fewer than Trey McBride, and he's 5th in expected fantasy points over that stretch. And he draws a great matchup this week against a Titans defense that A, is not very good, and B, plays zone at the 8th highest rate. You look at it, his man versus zone numbers this year, only 0.18 targets per out run, 0.82 yards per out run, and 0.19 fantasy points per out run versus man. But then against zone, 0.25, 2.1, and 0.42. Those numbers go way up against zone defense. Plus, you look at the last 2 games. I mean, I know 2 weeks ago or a few weeks ago, Davis Mills didn't play the entire game, but he played a lot of that game. In those last 2 games, he has scored 32 fantasy points, which is 4th most. CJ Stroud is out. Davis Mills is getting the start. And once again, Dalton Schultz is barely rostered in over half of sleeper leagues right now, 53%. And he's only being started in 32% of them. So even if Schultz isn't on your waiver wire, but you have him on your bench, and you don't love the tight end you've got right now, go ahead. Take a chance on Dalton Schultz. Now, if you need to go a little bit deeper here, I like Zach Ertz this week. Last week, he tied Debo for the team lead in target share and routes ran and had 9 expected fantasy points, which isn't a huge number, but it's not bad for a tight end. Now he gets a Dolphins team that's allowing the 3rd most fantasy points to tight ends. They also play the 6th most too high, 55% of the time. Again, Ertz absolutely at his best against too high. You look at the numbers here, 0.2, 0.18, 0.15 targets per out run versus man zone single high, 0.57, 1.73, 1 yard per out run, and 0.15, 0.36, 0.2 fantasy points per out run, again, versus man zone single high. Then you look at too high, 0.27 targets per out run, 2.04 yards per out run, and a 0.67 fantasy points per out run. Zach Ertz dominates too high coverage. He loves it for some reason. The Dolphins play a ton of it. This is a good matchup for Zach Ertz this week. And then finally, we got to have a tight end going up against the Bengals, right? Yeah, definitely. Pat Freiermuth, again, if you really need to get deep here, I think Freiermuth is well worth the potential upside or risk here. He gets the best tight end matchup possible against the Bengals this week. The last time these teams played, he had 5 catches, 111 yards, and 2 touchdowns. Now, before you say, well, I have to start him, I do want to have a little bit of caution here. I want to just give you a little bit of warning here. First of all, he only runs about 50% of the routes. Now, in that game last time, his route percentage was closer to 70%, but that was because Calvin Austin missed the game. Calvin Austin is playing. His route percentage is not super high, and not every tight end has gone off against the Bengals. Like Tucker Kraft didn't have a great game against them when they played. There is risk here that he doesn't blow up again. But that being said, it is the Bengals. It's worth taking a risk on Pat Freiermuth. I mean, if you're looking at guys like Pat Freiermuth, or, you know, you're way down there at the bottom of the barrel like Isaiah Likely, I don't know, maybe Dawson Knox with the Bills, you know, guys like that, I would just take a chance on Freiermuth this week. There you go, 10 sneaky starts that could potentially come through for you in Week 11 if you're in a pinch. But of course, if you somehow missed all the amazing content we have for you in Week 11, don't worry. You can go binge watch it right now from our Week 11 playlist right here.